So good evening, everyone, and welcome to Girls from Away, the Mill Girls of Hespeler. My name is Carly Boileau, and I am the Gallery Assistant at Cambridge Art Galleries. This special event is presented in conjunction with Celebration of Women and the current Preston Gallery exhibition, Spin, Twirl, Twist. Before we begin tonight's event, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which Cambridge Art Galleries is situated on is part of the Haldimand Tract, which is the traditional land of the Six Nations of the Grand River and Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. I'd also like to say that since we are gathering virtually tonight from many different locations across Canada and North America, perhaps, that I'd just like to invite you all to reflect and recognize how these places are home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit persons who continue to live and work on these lands today. Acknowledging this reminds that our great standard of living is directly related to the resources of Indigenous peoples and that each one of us bears personal responsibility in reconciliation. Now it's my privilege to introduce tonight's guests, Newfoundland and Labrador playwright, writer, and performer Bernadine Stapleton, writer, theater creator, director, and producer Nicole Smith, and the former senior policy planner for the City of Cambridge, Valerie Spring. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. I am so thrilled for our event tonight. It's been a long time in the making. It was just so serendipitous, and I think we've all talked about that when we first started chatting way back. Gosh, at the beginning of the summer, I think it was, and I'm just delighted. So thank you, the three of you, for joining us tonight. It's gonna be great.
Thank you so much for having us, Carly. And it was serendipitous. So we're all really excited to get to talk about this and really grateful that you've given us the chance.
Well, I will let you three take it away, and I'm looking forward to learning so much more about these wonderful women that made the journey from Newfoundland to Cambridge. But I will let you guys tell their story. And so thank you.
Thank you.
So I'll start with sort of how this came to be. I was a student at the University of Waterloo, and I was studying public history, Canadian history. And one of my professors, Dr. Ken McLaughlin, was writing a book called The Making of a Canadian City. And part of his work was Dominion Woolens. He was from Hespeler, and Dominion Woolens played a huge role in his upbringing because his father worked there. And so he knew a lot of people. He was in and out of the mill as a young boy. And so it was an important part of his childhood, and he wanted it to be part of the book. And so sort of based on that, we certainly talked about it in classes, about the importance Dominion Woolens played in the community throughout its history, but in particular during the Second World War, when recruitment of the men that worked there was so high that jobs were being left vacant and needed to be filled. And the obvious choice was to fill them with women. It wasn't, the recruitment of women wasn't unique to Canada. I mean, the federal government had what they called the NSS, the National Selective Service, and there was a real need to fill positions in war industries across the country. But surprisingly or not, there was a greater need in Ontario, where a lot of the war industries were located. And so the National Selective Service was helping industries find female workers. And initially, they were looking at unmarried women at the age of 20 to 25. What I find interesting is that age limit gradually came down as the need increased. And you know, when you look at the statistics of there being over 1 million women recruited from the rural areas of Canada to bring them into, urban areas, places like Hespeler and Cambridge in particular, So there was this need, and for Dominion Woolens, they hit upon this idea to go to northern Ontario and to Newfoundland. And what's interesting about Newfoundland is that, of course, it wasn't part of Canada at the time. They hadn't become part of the Confederation. So it was another country. And so to bring these young women from another country, there was another step in the recruitment process. They had to pass a physical. They had to have often permission from their families. Again, because of their age, their parents had to agree to let these 16, 17-year-old girls travel to another country and pass the medical and all of that. So it was quite a process, and Hespeler wasn't a huge community. And so all of a sudden you have this influx of young women who are away from home for the first time in their lives. They're earning their own money. They don't have anybody telling them how they get to spend it. I'm sure a number of them were sending money home, but the idea is that all of a sudden they have this freedom that they've never had before. And Dominion Woolens recognized that this could be an issue, and so they had residents there were chaperones, there were security guards. Their life in Hespeler was well regulated. They worked long hours, 6 days a week, and when they weren't working, there were activities for them, and this was all to keep them busy and content. And for a lot of young women, this was something that they could never imagine experiencing because of the newfound freedom. And so I was so lucky that working with 2 other colleagues, we were able to reach out to women who had worked at Dominion Woolens and ask them to share their story with us. And, looking back on it now, it's interesting sort of the reluctance of people to tell their story. They couldn't believe that we would have any interest in what they were doing, like 40 years ago, right? And here we are all these years later, and we're still interested in what they were doing. But for them, they were very modest. They didn't see what they did as being unusual. And yet we know in the big scheme of things, in terms of the community and the province and the country, it did have significant ramifications. And I think that's, when I think about the research we did, we left so much out because it's a huge topic. When you start thinking about the wages that they weren't earning, they were earning 40 or 50% less than the men had doing the same job. They had money, so it impacted the economy and the number of businesses that came about as a result of these women being in the community. And so it's a huge story, and I'm so glad that we're telling a part of it. Right? It's an important part of our history, and in particular, an important part of our women's history, because it's a jumping off point, in my opinion, for what else women were doing during the war years. We kind of kid about Rosie the Riveter, but that was true, right? We had women working in all industries, logging, shipping, aircraft building. When you think about what it did for women and the freedom and, I guess, exposure to what else they could be doing aside from being a nurse. Nothing wrong with the nurses, of course, but what they could do beyond just what they had typically saw themselves as. And then, of course, you have what happens after the war and the expectation that they will return to their households. They will return even back to Newfoundland. All of this is part of the story. And so I'm afraid delighted's going to be an overused word tonight, but I'm so delighted that we are talking about this again, because I think it helps put women in the workforce kind of in perspective. And it starts really with what they were doing during the Second World War.
Absolutely.
Thank
Absolutely. Thanks so much for all of that, Valerie. I feel like, yeah, Bernadine had the question for all of us, sort of how we first got into the story and why we were interested in doing it. And so to add to, I'm just jumping in, we decided to do this sort of round robin. So that's why there's no one technically facilitating it. We're just chatting with all of you that we can't see right now. But sort of what happened next in the timeline, I guess, of getting it to the stage or deciding to do a play about it was that my partner, who's a sort of local historian in Cambridge, I'm based in Cambridge half of the time and St. John's the other half of the time now. But he knew this story because he was very interested in the mill itself. The mill is a huge part of Hespeler history. For anyone who's from here, they know that. And had just sort of told me in passing about this huge influx of Newfoundland women who had come over during the war. And I just sort of tucked it away because I thought, that's really interesting, because the more you sort of looked into it, the bigger the story, it became clearer that it was a bigger story than a just in passing sort of thing. Like it's the reason 1 in 4 Cambridge residents by the 70s could trace their roots back to Newfoundland. Like there was just a huge impact to the community that went completely unspoken about. So I had sort of tucked it away and started looking into it a little bit. And at the time, this was about 5 years ago now, I was really, really an emerging artist, and I knew it was a big story to tell and that I didn't want to tell it alone. And then I met Bernadine at a festival, and sometimes you meet people and you're like, I need to keep that person in my life forever. So then you tell them about a story and you trap them with it. And you hope they'll want to keep writing something about it with you. And then the more we dug into it, I came across Valerie's amazing thesis and all of the interviews. And that was in 86, Valerie, that you did that? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, without those voices and without those interviews, the story truly would have been almost entirely lost. But that was sort of my piece in this fruition puzzle.
And then Nicole, yes, came to St. John's, Newfoundland for the Women's Work Theatre Play Development Festival. And she started telling me about this story that I had never heard tell of. And I couldn't believe that I'd been an artist in this province for 40 years and never heard of this amazing phenomenon. I'd never heard of all these stats out of Cambridge. And the fact that it was a women's story felt really, really important and really, really essential. And the more that Nicole told me about the work that Valerie had done, the more we became intrigued by the fact that no one in Newfoundland knew about this at all.
Yeah.
And so Nicole, actually, I think Nicole, you got our first grant, our Canada Council grant, and we started researching, and I went to Cambridge and we walked in. Can you remind me of the little museum that we went to, Nicole?
Yes, the Hespeler Heritage Center. Also known as the Company of Neighbors, but
right. And the gentleman's name there is
Mr. Larry Turner, who I believe is tuned in tonight as well.
So we walked in the door, and this gentleman has done such a beautiful job of just preserving all of these aspects of that community and the area. But in particular, he had given such detail and care to the Girls from Away, and that's where the name of the play came from. That's what we named our play, because we walked into this room and the wall was just covered in photographs of all of these young women. The Newfoundland Girls from Away, I think one of them was captioned Girls from Away in 1942. And we looked at all of these smiling faces, these young, vibrant women. They all looked like starlets. as Valerie referenced, they were treated so well. They weren't just there. I think this is what perhaps makes it a little bit more different as well from other war factory experiences, is that these girls were doing the work, but they were also transforming a community, and they were a really integral part of the war effort. Like their mission was to buck up the boys. They were featured in the newsletters. There were photographs. They were an essential part of the war drive and the morale that kept the community going. Whether they were spending their wages on going to the dentist, fashion was very important. We have a line in our play about Hespeler being the fashion capital of Canada. The other thing too that we've touched on that is really important to me as a Newfoundlander. I mean, ask anybody from Newfoundland, and even in this day and age, many Newfoundland and Labradorians find it difficult to leave home. It's part of our culture. It's part of who we are, the tie to the land we live on and to the sea that surrounds us. And, you know, there's the joke about ask a Newfoundlander who's been away for 40 years and they're just waiting to get back home. And so at that time, to have a recruiter come to particularly central Newfoundland, Western Newfoundland, was a big trip. And so for a 16-year-old or a 20-year-old girl to make this trip was a huge life decision. I mean, it wasn't like even today where you could fly in someplace and, you know, if it didn't work out, okay, back you go. Although that did happen, but it was, as Valerie mentioned, there were passports and health certificates. One lady shared that her mom had to get written permission from an archbishop. Multiple trains, ferries, customs, multiple trains. Then suddenly you're in a different country. And we started knitting together, pun intended, I guess, Nicole and I. It's sort of a fabric of all of the stories. We read so much of what Valerie had done. And then we just started workshopping a play. And we've been through the hardest part, as both Valerie and Nicole have said, is that the story is so vast that we just have to make so many hard choices that we're still in the process of. The other thing that really informs the journey of the play is that a journalist here named Heather Barrett did a CBC documentary that incorporated Valerie and us and some of the girls from away, their families that we had been able to find. And then an outpouring began. We began hearing from people across the country and from different parts of the world who said, my mom, my grandmother. Up until that time, the very few people who knew about it in Newfoundland had it all tucked away in little bits and pieces because nobody thought it was an important story. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so we were supposed to debut the first version of Girls From Away, unfortunately, the year that the pandemic happened. So we did a lot of online work. And then this summer, just recently, we did an onstage workshop production at the Gordon Pinson Center for the Arts in Grand Falls, Windsor, Central Newfoundland. And our hope is, it is now a musical with original music from Tim Matson and Kirsten Noel, who are brilliant composers here in our province. And so our hope is that next summer, we will have a more finely tuned full musical performance of Girls From Away that incorporates this story.
Yes, and that's been in development now. How long do you think, Bernadine? 4 years, 5 years?
Definitely almost 5 years.
And that's what stage we're at with it. So that just, it takes a long time to craft something urgent and is interesting from something so large, I think, and rich.
I had one of the quotes from one of the, I think it was one of the articles that was written, that Valerie, probably a little bit before your time, about one of the women working in the factory said that they were making enough fabric in a week to stretch from Grand Falls to Bishop's Falls, which are two communities in Newfoundland that are roughly 20 miles apart. So that's actually how much material was actually being generated. You know, it was like this river of fabric that never stopped. And when Nicole and I were fortunate enough to get to do a tour of the mill, the remaining structure is incredibly solid. It's incredibly vast. And we stood on the same floorboards, which have not changed in all these years. And some of that equipment is still there. And you can imagine the noise, the whistle they call the banshee blowing, the coming and going, the sort of the hard work of it, and the glamour. But Valerie, I wondered if you could speak a little more about, you talked about the significant ramifications of this outpouring of young women. I'm really curious about, elaborating on that a little bit.
Well, what we found interesting was that, even so many years after we were interviewing the women, that they were very much a community. As Nicole has said, there's the Newfoundland Club. People can trace their history back to Newfoundland. And so there was very much, I don't want to say a clique, but they certainly were the girls from away. And so it made it a little hard for the young women who were local Hesplerites, to kind of befriend people and so on, because they really came often with their own friends. They came with their sisters, their cousins, whatever, and it made them feel a little more secure to be coming with people that they knew. So they had their own place to live. They had the various residents that had been constructed for the sole purpose of housing these young women, and so there was a little bit of isolation between the women that were here, originally, and the women that came into the community. So, that was part of the social dynamics, and certainly the implications for the economic development of the community. Bernadine, as you said about Hespeler being the fashion capital, when they talked, it was so wistful about the number of shoe stores there had been and the number of dress stores. For them, to be able to spend money and buy, a new set of gloves or whatever, it did have huge ramifications for the community.
Yeah.
I think, Nicole, you had mentioned there are actually some family members who are.
I think so. Yes, I think so. I know Marie Pendon, who's been amazingly in contact about her mother, who was a mill girl. And Daisy Nichols and her daughter, I believe, are tuning in. And hello to everyone who's here who had this experience or is directly related to this experience. The anecdotes too, when you just mentioned the fashion shops opening up, Valerie, it just made me think like, and Bernie, when you were talking, just a couple of the things you had said, that there are so many little anecdotes in this story too that were so interesting, like the fact that a lot of the Newfoundland girls spent their first paycheck on the dentist. So the dentist business started skyrocketing in Hespeler at the time. We found that so interesting. Or the underwear, how the recruiter would go, and there's a story about how the recruiter would go and recruit these women when he was in Newfoundland by looking at the clothing lines and seeing if there appeared to be some kind of undergarment belonging to a young lady, because they could only hire young single women. Is that correct? Yes.
Right. So it was a manager, Fred Hutchinson, that told us that story. And when he told us that, Dr. McLaughlin was there at the time, and when he was telling this story, it was just like gold. Like, you were just like, really? That's what you did? It was, yeah, we just knew we had a good line to put in a book, or in this case in a play, because you know, the just the idea that a man would be driving around the countryside looking for, you know, women's lingerie. Like, it just, I don't know. It just struck me as particularly funny that that's how the recruitment process worked in Newfoundland, you know.
Totally, totally. And we definitely clung to that story for the play. We just see a comment here from Christopher Dunn, who played our wonderful all-purpose man in our workshop production of Girls from Away this past summer.
Yeah, so the trajectory of the play, Valerie, and, you know, next summer, we just want to say, hopefully the world will feel good to travel again, and coming to Newfoundland is like one of the best places you can come. The trajectory of our play follows a couple of young girls who are recruited and who experience a lot of opposition from their families. And, you know, it's not that anybody didn't want the best for anybody, but, you know, thinking about these really tiny communities and the unknown of it all, but also for these young women, there were so little opportunities at that time. You know, you could be a maid and get like $16 a month. You could possibly maybe be a teacher or a nurse, but really you could only work till you got married. You definitely didn't work past that point. Pregnant women definitely were not allowed to work. So the allure of going to Hespeler was large. And Valerie, I think the other reason that we're so indebted to you is that traditionally, when people think of the out-migration from Newfoundland, we always think it's a men's story. That, you know, whether they were building skyscrapers in the States or they were out west working in Alberta, it's always been traditionally the Newfoundland work ethic was attributed to men, but actually it began with these women. And so we really try to represent that in our play. And Nicole and I definitely always work to have a balance, that this is a Newfoundland and Cambridge story, and to keep those voices equal.
Yeah.
And that's not always easy, because I'm boss.
But no, you're right. It is that balance. And what you were saying earlier, Valerie, about the sort of dynamic between the girls from away and the girls from here, we do delve into that a little bit too, because that's a really interesting dynamic to us, because they also had different freedoms, and they were both groups. I mean, when I say they were indebted differently to different places, and they were, you know, the girls from here weren't indebted to the mill in the same way as the girls from away were, but they were living at home, and they were often giving money back to their families when the girls from away were getting that sort of first opportunity to be somewhere else, and the attention was on them. And anyway, you could imagine the tensions that would arise. Did the women talk about any of that much with you?
No, I think because they were still in the community, and
Yeah,
they saw women at the grocery store, right? But I think what's interesting when we talk about the importance of fashion, and one of you referred to seeing the pictures of, you know, what look like pinup girls almost. You know, they send out the Dominion Woolens newsletter to the men on the front, and they had a you know, I don't know what the other phrase is, but a pinup picture, an attractive woman who was saying, you know, we're holding down the fort in your absence, and we're here to, you know, we're supporting you. And so the name of my thesis was As Cute as Buttons, because one of the managers said, you know, they do the work of men, and oftentimes they did the work better, just given their attention to detail and manual dexterity, that sort of thing. Oftentimes women were, for, specific tasks, were actually better than their male counterparts. But, then the caveat was, and they always look as cute as buttons doing the work, right? So here they're being praised for the good job that they do, but then the reminder is that they're still women. I don't know if you get the point. They did a job equal to men, but they looked pretty doing it. And so I found that really interesting. And still, when I read that the women who worked in the logging industry referred to as lumberjills, like, really? So is that kind of trying to adjust to having women in working in places that they had never worked before. And so you're right, there's a lot to unravel with this story.
We could give our hosts a heads up that we do have a little video to share, that because we're talking about so much imagery, we have a little video that Marty did for us. That was one of our little previews from last year, that you can see how the women looked, and we can talk a little bit about the recruitment reel.
Yes.
As well.
Yes. I don't know if you need a second more than that there, Gabrielle. Oh, she's brilliant, brilliant.
Attention, women of Newfoundland. Do you have what it takes to be a girl from away? Come work abroad in the exotic country of Canada. The war effort needs your dedication, courage, and tenacity. While our boys are abroad, we need our broads to buck up the boys. Dominion Woolens and Worsteds is seeking ambitious young women to answer the call and work on the floor of the largest textile mill in the British Empire. Enjoy the good life in one of our supervised residences with gourmet meals and social outings to rival a movie star. Pose for pin-ups. Wear the latest fashions from the fashion capital of Hespeler, Ontario. In Hespeler, we love our Newfoundland girls from away. Canada needs you. Be a girl from away. Apply today. $16 per week, not including accommodations. Round-trip train fare provided. Applicants must have an approved certificate of health, valid passport, and written permission from the family patriarch or archbishop. Young unmarried women and spinsters only need apply. Come see Girls from Away, the world premiere of this play with music at the Kitchen Party Theater Festival in Grand Falls, Windsor. This summer, make us a stop on your staycation. Stay for the Girls from Away. Details coming soon.
Thanks for that. So this is the little idea that actually sparked an entire theater festival. That brilliant voiceover done by Christopher Dunn. So Valerie, it came from your work being mentioned to Nicole, coming to me, and then we ended up working with the Arts and Culture Centers in Newfoundland and Labrador. We have we have 5 arts and culture centers that go right across the province. And so the Arts and Culture gave us a residency in Grand Falls, Windsor. We were there for a month before the pandemic, doing research and discovering that nobody knew anything. And consequently, the centers asked us if we would pilot a small theater festival. So that's what we did. So we had a group of, I think, just over 10 people working not only on the Girls from Away, but some other plays as well. So it's sort of like from that little germ of an idea, we've now got this sort of thing that's sort of rapidly growing as well, which is all inspired by the Girls from Away.
And that's cool too. That's a cool point, because I just think, to go back to what Valerie was saying, where with the cute as buttons phrase, that's where the focus would always land, instead of the actual huge impact that these women had and have had since then, and are still having. You know what I mean? Even in terms of what you just outlined, Bernadine. And it's interesting too, I think Heather Barrett was the one who pointed it out when she did the CBC documentary, but in that photo that inspired our title, Girls from Away, I think there are maybe 12 girls in the picture, and behind them, like you can barely see them, are the two supervisors. And the only recorded names on that photograph are the two male supervisors. So anyway, just another point to your point.
If anybody has
I find
any,
it back.
you can, sorry, go ahead, Valerie.
No, I just find it fascinating, as I've said previously, that, you know, this has caught on with you and Nicole the way it has, and morphed into what it's becoming. I had no idea when we interviewed those women so long ago that we'd be talking about it almost, well, it's 35 years later, right? So it's very exciting.
The thing that really also made an impression on me when I spent time in Cambridge, and I hope to be going back again early in the new year, was, as you know, going into different stores and things around the community of Cambridge, and people would say, "Where are you from?" And I'd say, "Oh, I'm from Newfoundland," and people would say, "Oh, are you from Bell Island?" Or it was a knowledge, because often people would say, well, my grandmother's from Newfoundland, or my grandmother, my great grandmother. And that has a deep emotional impact, that people hold on to that and consider themselves to be Newfoundlanders, perhaps without ever having been here. And we definitely built that theme into the play. We have a character who discovers in her life, that her mother was actually a girl from away, and she tries to research, the history of her mom and where she came from, and her time at Dominion Woolens. And the line that she is given is to, I think it's to go home where they'll welcome you with open arms. Which I think is really, really true, because these girls brought Newfoundland with them. And, as we mentioned, there were all kinds of reasons, like you just couldn't pop back and forth to go for visits. And in some cases, family members did follow them, but they had to bring their Newfoundland with them. And, we got a really strong sense of that as well in your research, that nobody ever lost their identity as being from Newfoundland.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I wondered, Valerie, did you have, there was obviously a sense of interest from you when you decided to do this as your thesis, but did you feel a sense of the importance that these women had on everything at that time?
That's a really good question, Nicole, because, as a university student, I was thinking more about how to get these tapes transcribed, how to protect their privacy, right? Going through the editing process. So just kind of the nitty gritty. I'm sort of embarrassed to admit that I wasn't really thinking about things like you're bringing up the fact that they left communities in Newfoundland, and we didn't talk about that. Yeah. We didn't say. That should have been one of our first questions. Who did you leave behind, right? Mm-hmm. And we were more interested in their life here and the job that they did here, where they lived, what they did with their money. Do you know what I mean? Like, we didn't talk about what it must have felt like to have left their home, their family, their country behind. And so I think that's what's great about the work you're doing, is that we're now getting to that, right? We're kind of asking those questions, that missing link. We take the girls, we took the girls from the time they stepped off the train in Hustler, and we really didn't talk to them about what it must have felt like. Certainly we got some of that. The homesickness and the things that they missed. But I don't think we ever asked them, what was the name of your community? what was the population of your community? How different is it from where, like, how different is Hespeler from where you came from, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So to have the balance that you're presenting is, I think, an important component to this whole story.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, but it's like you said, I mean, everything you did delve into in and of itself is so vast. This story is just really enormous. It really is.
Yeah. And as well, like at the time we were doing it, there's a bit of pushback about doing oral histories, right? You know, people questioned what story you would get. And certainly you saw that. People were careful about what they said, what they told you, and you had to gain their trust and reassure them that, you know, we weren't planning to expose anything they didn't want us to. They would get an opportunity to review the transcripts. They would be sealed away for 25 years, like the actual interview. And so we tried to kind of reassure them what we were doing and why we were doing it. But oral history just wasn't something that was mainstream at the time we were doing it, which is ironic when you think about how traditionally we hand down history, right? Certainly, you know, from my standpoint, my grandparents met at the mill. Now this is, you know, way before the war, so the mill was always part of my history, right? Because I could so relate to my grandparents and the fact that that's where they met. My mom was born in Hespeler, you know, grew up in Hespeler. So the mill always was interwoven, if you will, in our family history. So to be able to do this story and look at it, you know, at a much different time in its corporate heritage was interesting to me as well.
Yeah, and I'm happy you brought that up too about, I think you quote something in your thesis like the mill was Hespeler and Hespeler was the mill. That stuck with us so much so that we sort of created a character representative of the mill, because that really is the Cambridge connection, right? That really is the thing that grounds Cambridge in the story is that mill.
Yes,
right.
and the girls from away stayed and continued to go to Hespeler after the war. They kept their jobs in a lot of cases, so that was unusual in a lot of cases, because once the men began returning home, a lot of the women had to exit, but that didn't happen at Dominion. And they were able to continue that sort of trajectory of change, of more emancipation, with being completely, being completely unaware of it. And, also reminding us of what communication was like at that time, unlike today when everything is instant information. The reason, I guess, that the history was completely lost in Newfoundland, sort of in an official sense, is because when the women married, their names changed. Nobody wrote it down. There was no, letters going back and forth. But the world had bigger things on the plate at the time, and so gradually the stories were lost. And Valerie, to go back to something else that you had said about the role of women in the war, we also, Nicole and I, started hearing from a lot of women, family members who said, well, my mom was working in Cape Breton, and she was, I don't know if it was a ship factory, but it was some kind of war factory that, there were lots of different places that pockets of women were going into, and being a part of that work ethic that was so important at the time.
Yeah. Yes, and I think why this whole event felt so serendipitous too is because of the point of Carly's exhibition, Spin, Twirl, Twist, which is on November 21st.
Which is amazing.
Yeah, and just, it was so great when they reached out, Carly and Gabrielle, when you both reached out to us, because, I mean, I don't know if you want to mention briefly sort of the connection you see between the stories, but just this notion of everyday textiles and stories woven together. And anyway, we had a whole conversation about it, but I'm glad you popped back in, because I was hoping you might.
I am, and yeah, like you were saying, Nicole, and I wrote a couple notes down, but for the exhibition, you know, when I was initially thinking about it, I think I've mentioned this to you as well, I really started approaching it thinking about clothing and how the clothes we wear, you know, whether we're making a specific choice or not, really kind of says something about our own identity and our personality. And then it kind of that idea started to grow towards textiles in general and how they really are everywhere, you know, in our technology, under our feet, you know, they're just everywhere. And they kind of bear witness to our lives in this kind of interesting way. And I mean, we've talked about how, and you've said a few things tonight, like how it's so interwoven into our language. Again, no pun intended. Like that textiles and this creation of making fabrics and things, it really is everywhere. And so when I was fortunate enough to be introduced to the CBC documentary, radio documentary, and through my director, and then also she was introduced to it through one of our board members, and I just couldn't believe it. It was just everything I was thinking. I'm like, oh my goodness, you know, you're writing this play, and Valerie had done this research on this history, but I had only really known just on the surface about it. I knew that, you know, Cambridge had this big textile history. I knew that's why, you know, our collection at the Cambridge Art Galleries is textile and fiber based because of that history, but I had no idea. And I mean, I know we're just scratching the surface here with really all the history of the textile industry. And every time I talk to you, and as I'm listening to you all tonight, I get lost in the stories, and I just want to learn more and more. And I was actually, and I think I said this to you guys previously as well, one of the coffee shops in downtown Galt used to be a silk factory, or they used to make parachutes, or I can't fully remember what it was. And there were photos in there of these girls, and I've walked past.
Is that Melville?
That's Melville, that's right. Yeah, exactly. And I'd walked past there, you know, countless times. I've been in there countless times and hadn't noticed, like, there's this huge history there. And I'm just so grateful that we were able to bring this together. And yeah.
There's this fact too that I need to look up so that I don't always butcher it when I share it, but I'm going to try to share it anyway because I find it so fascinating. The Greek word for story or word or text is textos or something of the like.
Yeah.
And I always find that really interesting because it makes it textile, you know what I mean? And tactile and tangible. Yeah, right. And that really connects stories themselves, grounds stories themselves to something tangible to me.
I agree.
And I think that's another interesting connection.
Yeah, and the whole kind of, I guess, for the exhibition and where there's that main link between the play and your research is it really is about stories.
Yeah.
And, you know, going back to ancient Greece, and that's kind of where, and I think I told you that, where the title came from, is I had remembered that there was that story of the fates, and it was, you know, the three sisters, and they were spinning and twirling and twisting the destinies of the humans, right? And when I was doing my initial research and I was looking up more information about them, the fates they don't really have their own story in any of the original ancient Greek myths like Hercules or Jason do. They're always kind of, their presence is felt, but they're never actually in a story really, like they don't really appear, except for a couple instances. And then the one instance which inspired the title of the show was that the three fates sat spinning, twirling, and twisting. And what I love is when I first met with you, Nicole, is when you were saying that I guess there was a department in each of the mills. Like you said there was a spinning department and a twisting department. And
looming. I don't know.
Yeah,
But yes. Totally.
There's so many,
Yeah.
connections in both a literal sense. It was just, yeah, it was just such a treat.
And you're right. It always goes back to story in all of these parts of this overall story. It's all about whose story gets told and passed down and remembered and valued.
Yeah.
So anyway, I wonder if that's a good note to open it up to the Q&A on, unless any of you had other questions first that you wanted to throw into the ring.
No, I'd love to just add that for Nicole and I as well, the mill itself is a really important part of the play. It is almost like a character, and actually we do have a character in there that represents the mill and the importance of just as a structure, what it absorbed and what it housed for all of those years, the tears, the joy, the laughter, the work,
Yes.
all of that. Like that felt really important to us, particularly having had the chance to go look at it. And even though I know part of it is now no longer there, but it's still a very intimidating building, very impressive.
Totally. Yep. It's as enormous as the story.
Yes.
If anyone does have any questions, of course, you can use the little chat at the bottom. I guess I could maybe start things off. Let me see here. There's so many threads, not to use another pun, that I could lead with. But can you maybe just, for the sake of those that aren't in the theater realm of things, so you start with your idea, and then you talked about it a little bit, and then you kind of met with Bernadine and you grew the idea from there. And how does that development process work, really?
That's a great question. And thank you for asking it, because I think theater development is something that doesn't get talked about a lot, and just how much time goes into it.
Well, yeah, you were saying 5 or 6 years, right? So that's a significant amount of time.
I mean, a lot of it too, truthfully, has to do with funding and what funding you can get, as anyone who works in the arts knows. But yeah, we started with the idea. We got a grant to do initial research. We ended up getting the residency that Bernadine spoke about out in Grand Falls, Windsor, which is basically smack dab in the middle of Newfoundland, where a lot of the women came from, the girls from away, I mean. And we spent time in the community, and we researched, and we wove together a very initial draft of that. And then we had some people in mind, some actors to work with. And so for our workshop in 2020, which was all virtual, they were also a big part of sort of getting that on its feet. I mean, on its virtual feet for the first time, shaping it, really shaping those sort of pillars, definitely the characters. At that time, we thought we wanted it to be all women. We were very resistant to add a male character. Bernadine was the one to bring it up at one point, and I was real hesitant. But then the more we dove into it, the more we were like, yes, that needs to happen. So we have what we call an all-purpose man. So he plays, beautifully played by Christopher Darcy Dunn, but he plays the recruiter and the conductor and these various supervisors and the love interest. And he's sort of a thread throughout.
So I just want to say that, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to cap it off and say, after that workshop, then we, as Bernadine had mentioned before, got to do it for the first time, this time on its feet. But in between that time, we had decided it should be a musical, and we don't write music. So we recruited more collaborators. So that's where we're at now. It just keeps sort of growing.
We do. I know there was a comment about from Derek wondering. So our dream is yes, to get this play to Cambridge, and
beautiful, yes.
as Nicole mentioned, the search for funding and to build a play that's very solid and portable. We got so many great stories that what we did was we have a lot of composite characters. So we couldn't have as many characters as there were great stories, but we took a lot of the most theatrical ones and the most moving ones, and so we molded five different characters. And but yes, it's our passion that we must bring this play to Cambridge. It's a feel-good musical. We were unabashed about that. We wanted people to walk in the theater and immediately feel, boom, you know what it was like to be in Newfoundland, and then boom, you knew what it was like to be in that factory. So we wanted to build a very sensory experience, and the music is definitely helping us with that a lot, because the songs just transport you into that world, and it feels very, Andrews Sisters, like some of the music, very, very true to the era.
Oh, fantastic.
Yes, Tim and Kirsten are a husband and wife team, and they are fantastic. So it's been really exciting to get to work with them, even preliminarily. So delving into it more is going to be exciting.
Yeah, I can only imagine. It's so, I'm going to see it one way or another. I know I am, even if I have to travel the globe to see it. Because it's just, as I said, I get lost in the stories and the anecdotes, and it is so impressive that you're able to take these wonderful stories and you combine them into one character. That is impressive and wonderful.
I think it's been really a special thing for both Bernadine and I too, just because we both, it is a story of both of our homes. So it adds another layer of investment to it, I think. I won't speak for you, Bernadine, but I think that that's true in our conversations.
I know there's a question from Hannah there, Nicole. Hannah, who actually, she's in the Q&A, and Hannah, actually, we brought her in she was our pinch hitter stage manager. She came in from Cambridge and became part of our Newfoundland family. And the thing that happens that Nicole and Hannah can attest to is you come and you think like you're just going to breeze in and then swan off to the rest of your life, but it doesn't work that way. It's always very hard to say goodbye.
Yes. So Hannah has a question for the group that says, what do you think the most important or most impactful thing the Girls From Away brought to Ontario was? Or if you could choose one word that represents them as a group, what would that be?
That's an excellent question.
Oh.
I always think of the word tsunami.
You do? Yeah, you bring that up a lot.
Yeah, and there's a historical event that happened in the Burin Peninsula where my family lives in 1926. I think there was a tsunami that devastated the entire region. And so I don't think of the girls as being a tsunami in terms of devastation, but I just think of this wave that just like basically kept on going and going and going and going and going and just eroded things and changed things and moved things aside and built new, just sort of toppled a lot of things while making room for new things. So I always think of them like as a tsunami or a force of nature.
I love that so much. I always just think, when I think about the Girls From Away, I think about brave comes to mind, just the term brave and the word brave, because when you think about what they really had to do and what that really meant, takes guts. It was an opportunity, I understand, but it also, that's a lot. It's a lot to do. So I think they were very brave.
Agree.
What about you, Val? Do you have any?
I can't top tsunami. That's
I know,
brilliant.
it's perfect.
Yeah, tsunami and bravery. I think those are pretty good.
Yeah, and I was thinking courage, like Nicole is saying, you know, to uproot themselves and to head into the unknown as young women. I think of myself, you know, at 16 or 17 years old, and would I have had the courage to do that? I'm not sure. So certainly a lot of admiration for them, and I hope they know that we're talking about them, that we admire them as much as I did 35 years ago, you know, that we really appreciate what they did.
That's a really good point too, and I think it's come up in our conversations before, and I think you mentioned it a little bit earlier, all of you tonight, how what the girls didn't necessarily see themselves as doing anything great, but in fact, like they have done so much, and that is really incredible. And I'm glad, like you were saying, that we were talking about them all these years later, and it's important.
Well, it's a great point, and it also ties into the notion of everyday textiles, because I think, I mean, it sounds cliche, but it is true. Everybody has a story, and we tend to focus on certain ones, but an everyday story can be as impactful as, you know, a large one that gets a lot of attention. And sometimes I don't know, there are just a lot of things that happen that at the time maybe people don't see as being as impactful as they actually are to
And
others.
I also think like the experience was where they were going and what they were doing. Like they were going to Hespeler and Dominion Woolens. And I think that in any other situation, these stories could have been absolutely terrible. And we're not saying that there weren't stories that were sad or didn't work out, but the fact that this mill and this community basically had everything set up, like they had they stayed in homes and housing. They had a matron on site. They had so many activities. There was choir, there was baseball, they were fed galore. I mean, everything was done in such a good way that, you know, we haven't really heard a lot of stories like that. Like this could have been a very different direction had they gone someplace else to a different community. But they went where they did and they experienced what they did. And I think that's what makes this an interprovincial story, that the Cambridge voice is as strong in our play as the Newfoundland voice. You know, it's very important that these two elements come together. And hopefully in the play, we've really represented that. You know, Valerie, as you were saying, that there were clashes and there was fights at the Bucket of Blood, and it wasn't always the boys. And jealousy, but you know, there was also friendship and camaraderie, and you know, lifelong friendships that were built on that. I often compare our play a little bit to the movie A League of Their Own. If people remember, that was the movie about the Women's Baseball League. Back in the day, I think it was famous because Madonna was in it, but it was actually a pretty good movie. And, you know, I compare it to that kind of story. You know, these gals were living their lives and living their best lives, and then it was over and it was done. And it wasn't until decades later that they actually got to experience their Hall of Fame moment. So I hope in a way we are providing that Hall of Fame moment, you know?
Oh, I think so. I definitely think so, for sure. Let's just see if there's any more questions. Oh, Gabrielle has said that they shaped our community in very profound ways, and they really did. I think they really, really did. Yeah, I just can't say it better than that, really.
No, that's beautiful. That's a beautiful way of putting it. And this event has been so special for Nicole and I, first of all, to spend time like this with Valerie, who's been such a profound part of this whole journey and continues to be so generous in every way as we move forward.
Absolutely.
Yes. And I
thank you.
Oh no, go ahead, Valerie.
Thank you. It's really been a thrill for me, you know, to think that you've taken such interest and such care in telling the stories. I mean, it would be easy to have this be kind of a superficial story, right? But you're delving into who these people really were and you're so respectful of who they were and why they're important to our community, that, you know, I can't say enough how grateful I am that the two of you have chosen this story, not just anybody, but the two of you.
Thank you. Thank you.
We have another comment from Taylor, and says, "Congratulations, everyone! I'm excited to see this play one day." Me too. I just can't wait.
That's the goal. That's the goal. We hope to definitely. I mean, as we've said time and time again, it's as important a story to Cambridge as it is Newfoundland. So hopefully we can get it here too.
That would be just fantastic. I mean, I know for one, I will be there opening box office day. Get my tickets.
Thank you so much, Carly. This has been fantastic.
Oh my gosh. Thank you, all three of you. Like, you've made this is such a delight. Again, I could just listen to you guys talk all night probably about these stories. I know there's, again, more and more stories, but I guess we do have to end it at some point. So yeah, it's just thank you, Bernie, Nicole, and Val. Is like, I've learned so much more every time I talk to you guys. I can't believe how much more I learn, and it's just such a privilege. So thank you.
One of the things that we really hope in the new year is that, well, I plan to go because we definitely want to delve a little more deeper into the research. But we are hoping to possibly do a little reading of maybe some excerpts or something in Cambridge in the new year, maybe as a little fundraiser, you know, because we really think it's important that that this story lives on the ground there. And that felt like a good way to start. So we might come looking for you in the new year.
Please do. You have my contact info.
And there's so many great performers there as well.
Oh yeah.
That we are longing to work with.
Oh, fantastic. Oh, well, and on that note, again, I will say thank you to the three of you. It's been such a pleasure listening to you guys tonight. I'd also like to thank my colleagues. They're wonderful, wonderful colleagues of mine. So Community Engagement Specialist Gabrielle Claremont, she's been working behind the scenes tonight. My Director and Curator Marcy Bronson, Exhibition Coordinator Matthew Teagle, and Education Officer Robert Thody. And of course to the audience, because without you, as theater folk know, there would be no there'd be no performance or event without the audience. So thank you everyone for tuning in. Thank you, Valerie, for researching all back in the day and choosing the Mill Girls for your thesis topic, because without that as well, I think who knows where their stories would have gone. So thank you for that. That's wonderful. And thank you for coming on tonight. Yeah. All of you.
This was great. Thank you.
Thank you. And so I will say good night, everyone.
Take care.